Welcome to Off Hours, a conversation between Jon Edwards and Chris Manning.
So last episode, we touched a little bit on really expensive liquids, things like lubricants for watches and resins for 3D printing. And with the lubricants in particular, it's astounding how much a very small amount will cost you and just how long that very small amount will last for you. And something interesting that popped up recently is a video published by Daniela Marin and Peter Speak over at the Naked Watchmaker that pays a visit to Tritech, which is the production facility where superluminova is made, which is the glowing pigment used in watches. One thing that's jumped out at me from that video is the fact that a single gram of superluminova powder is enough to print 100 to 500 watch dials, which is significant. And makes me realize the fact that the little tubes of it that I have are more than likely going to last me a lifetime, provided they'll still be glowing in a couple decades. But I do know that this stuff does tend to deteriorate over time and no longer holds that same glow factor or afterglow.
I don't know what the half-life is on superluminova. It must have some kind of half-life in terms of how bright it is and how long it stays bright like that, but I have no idea what it is.
Well, thankfully it's not a nuclear radiation half-life. So we were able to get rid of that with saying goodbye to radium. Although you can still get timepieces with tritium in them. And the nice thing about tritium compared to radium is that the radiation on it isn't strong enough to even really get through the crystal in a watch. So you don't really have any risk of nuclear radiation exposure from it if you were to wear it. Meanwhile, radium is just nasty. That's nasty stuff. And it has a half-life of about 1,300 years.
It is nice to see how superluminova is made, and it's also nice to see today that they're able to do excellent color matching between both the non-illuminated pigment, so when you're just seeing it in daylight, as well as the illuminated pigment. They're able to color match both of those to match either existing dials or a particular color that you're looking for. So it's kind of nice to be able to see that they do have that much flexibility in the way that they can actually mix and match those colors for you, depending on what it is that you need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they can also have two different colors if you wanted. So you can have it look a certain way in daylight and then look very different at night. And actually, you can even have something that looks exactly the same during the day and then will glow differently at night, which is something that Omega has recently leveraged in some of their new releases in the past month or so.
Yeah, I've got some blue superluminova at the studio, and in normal light, it actually looks blue, but it doesn't glow blue properly. It actually glows a green, which is a little bit annoying to me that it, because what I really wanted was something that was going to glow blue. Ideally be blue as well when you're just looking at it, but I'm a little annoyed the lume doesn't actually glow blue properly. And I do have a red that actually looks a very nice red when you're just seeing it in normal daylight, and then it also glows a nice red too. So it would be interesting to see what's involved in actually getting proper colors made up from them. I don't know what sort of volume you have to purchase from them in order to be able to get that sort of service.
I know James Thompson over at the Black Badger has a special relationship with him, and the stuff he's doing is fairly boutique. So I imagine the numbers there aren't super huge, and he's able to get just about any color combination that he wants from them.
Yeah, even though he's not doing a large amount in any particular color, he is doing enough volume with them between his own projects and projects that he's worked on with other companies like MB&F. He's done work with them. And James has just recently worked with GOS on an Aurora Borealis watch as well, which has some specific colored superluminate. So I suspect that just the volume of projects that he does with Superlume is what's allowed him to, to sort of build up that relationship. I don't know if I would be able to get similar service from them, just being, a small watchmaker and saying, "Oh, I'm going to use little bits of this on something." I'm not sure that I'd get that much out of them.
He has certainly built a name for himself in the domain of small things that glow.
Yeah, he is Mr. Superloom.
And as far as getting that perfect blue match goes, that is absolutely something that Tritech is capable of. And a number of watch manufacturers do have looms that are fairly standard, actually, that glow a nice blue, including
Mm.
both Rolex and Omega, which make a fairly high volume of timepieces that glow.
Yeah, I'm sure that what I would want is out there, and I'm sure they've made it, and it's probably available in massive quantities compared to what I would need. It's just a question of finding them, right? It's funny because the suppliers that are out there that tend to supply to small people like us, they don't tend to have a large selection of colors available. So that's really where that falls down.
And I noticed you've also picked up some pigment from Stuart Semple. I don't know where he's sourcing his glowing pigment from, but perhaps it's just the volume of it that's sitting in the jar. But it looks like it has quite a nice bright glow to it as well.
Yeah, Stuart Simple, we've talked about him because of the Black 3.0 that we've experimented with for our Project Minotaur dial. And he does lit pigment as well, which is a glow in the dark pigment like Super Luminova. As you said, I don't know who it is that he's working with to have those pigments made, but I have a blue pigment from him that is actually quite nice, and it glows a really nice blue. And I actually find that they glow for a longer period of time based on a similar amount of exposure to UV light than some of the Superloom. I've experimented with sort of small quantities of both to see how they last, and the stuff from Stuart Semple certainly holds up. It's impressive how bright it is and how long it lasts. So it may be that he's actually working with them to have them make it. I don't know. I'm sure that they're not the only people that are making something similar, and he doesn't have anywhere near the range of colors that they do. I think he has a green, a red, a blue. I think that's all the colors he has right now, but his are significantly less expensive. Yeah, so I'm actually working on a few pieces right now, a few pairs of cufflinks that I'm sort of experimenting with some design ideas, and I'm going to put a little bit of loom in them. One of them is going to be the red loom from Super Luminova. The other one is going to be the blue loom from Stuart Semple. So we'll see how they actually work in practice and how they respond in the real world.
And in the vein of how long things glow for, Super Luminova does come in various grades. And X1 is the one that shines and continues to glow for the longest period after it's been exposed to light. And then they have an A grade, which is what I would presume is the most commonly used superluminova pigment. And I shouldn't be using superluminova so interchangeably like this, because they do have specific names for the various pigments that Tritech develops. Superluminova is certainly the most popular and common, the Swiss-made pigments. And to Seiko's credit, they actually make a really nice loom that has an incredible glow to it.
Mm.
It's just another one of those things that Seiko does, that fully vertically integrated.
Well, that was important for them for their dive watches. So they wanted to make sure they had a good loom for their dive watches, and so I'm not surprised that they spent some time and energy making sure that worked well.
One of the other interesting things that I gleaned from this video is that Superluminova is actually a ceramic. So when it starts out as just as the raw material, it doesn't glow. And then they take that raw material and they dope it with some rare earth elements and stick it in a kiln in a very specifically formulated atmosphere. And when it comes out, it is a block of fired ceramic. And then they break that down and grind it down in machines that they weren't willing to show us. And then that powder is suspended in a binder, and then that binder is what allows the glowing pigment to adhere to the hands or indices or what have you on the watch. And then from there, the pigment goes into their quality control center. And that room, personally, it didn't look like a room I would like to work in. It looked windowless and kind of bland. But I can understand why, when you're performing quality control on Superluminova, why you'd want a windowless room. But the equipment in it was quite neat. So using laser diffraction to analyze the size of the particles, and then they're using a fluorescent spectrometer to measure the actual color that is radiating off of it when it's glowing, and then a camera setup to measure how long it actually glows for after it's been exposed to UV radiation. So are these cufflinks you'll be making that glow a product you think you'll have out in the market this year?
Oh, I don't know. I would be surprised if I sell any, or if I do, if I sell very many of them. It's just something that I was looking to play around with, because I wanted to experiment with some loom products to see how they function and see how well they work and whatnot, just to sort of get a sense of how I could use them in design. I don't think that I'm ever going to use them in a watch. I can't see myself, applying loom to watch hands or to indices or anything like that. If I was going to use super loom or something similar in a watch, I would probably go down the road of what GOS has done with a number of their watches, where they're doing something different with it. Like in this case, they're using it almost to light up the whole dial from the outside. And so it's a little bit different than sort of a normal loom situation. They have one that's really quite an interesting design, where they have a very, very thin piece of mother of pearl that's mounted over top of a plate that has superluminova on it. And there's enough UV that gets through the mother of pearl that it can charge the superlume, and then at night it will actually glow and light up the mother of pearl and radiate light through it. So the ideas like that, maybe there's something interesting there for me, but I don't think that I'm ever going to use superlume or anything similar in any of my watches. It just doesn't really appeal to me from an aesthetics point of view. So this is more just an experiment to see how it works and whether it's something that I might actually use in another design, more along the lines of what James is doing, where he's using it in some jewelry and things like that. Like he does a really nice ring, which has sakura petals in them. And then he's got the pink loom that sits inside of the petals. And so it actually glows a really nice pink color at night and is a really nice design. So I could see maybe using it for something like that, more jewelry based, but I don't think I'm ever going to use it in watches.
The effect that GOS has achieved there with it underneath the mother of pearl is really neat and is absolutely unique. I haven't seen that done anywhere else in the industry.
I don't know if there's anything that I'm not a big fan of mother of pearl normally, so I don't know that I would use it in that exact way. I've sort of bounced around some ideas of how I could use it with enamel, and to maybe try and light up enamel instead of lighting up mother of pearl, but that leads to some other issues and whatnot. So I don't know. We'll see. I wouldn't hold your breath if you're thinking, hey, maybe Chris is going to release a watch with a bunch of loom on it. It's probably not going to happen. Just like I'm very unlikely to ever design a dive watch. Things like that. Like they're just not really in the sort of the design sense that I'm looking for. So I'd be surprised if I ever use it in a watch.
Well, knowing now that Superluminova is a ceramic, it could actually potentially hold up to being fired in a kiln and being suspended in enamel as a binder rather than using a resin type binder.
That's a good point. I hadn't thought about that, and this video does state they're using significantly higher temperatures than what I use for my enamel work. So yeah, there is a chance that it might actually hold up to being fired with the enamel. I don't know how it would affect the enamel though. So one of with an enamel, the colors that you're getting out of it are a chemical reaction between the metal salts that are in the enamel and the base metal that you're enameling it on. And so that's why you get different colors. If you're enameling on, let's say, gold versus silver versus copper, the exact same enamel is actually going to give you different colors depending on which metal you have underneath it. And then those salts are going to react differently at different temperatures as well. And if you're dealing with translucent enamels like I tend to deal with, then you also have a clarity issue. So something like this is actually going to act as, it's going to create a haze inside of the enamel once it's fired. It may be worth it for the look that you get. Maybe it's something that's worthwhile experimenting with in a case where you don't have engine turning through it, where you're trying to see through the enamel like I tend to do. Maybe it's something that would work well with a cloisonné design or something like that. So yeah, well, it's something to experiment with and see what happens. The nice thing is it's inexpensive enough that it's easy to make up a couple test pieces and try firing them and see how it works.
In one area I have not seen superluminova employed that I would like to see is something along the lines of the constellation displays, or essentially what the sky looks like overhead, represented in a mechanical watch, and timepieces like the Star Caliber 2000 or Patek Philippe Sky Moon Tourbillon. I mean, these are some really high-end pieces. I mean, Jaeger-LeCoultre and a couple of other companies have released pieces in this vein as well. I mean, the Caliber 89 was another one from Patek too. And of course, the Graves super complication. But in nearly all of these instances, the stars are represented in gold. And I think it'd be neat to see the same thing done with superluminova.
That might be interesting. I could also see doing something with the moon in a moon phase where you're actually illuminating the moon at night using this. So that might be another place, or you could do something like a white enamel that has superlum in it, and then maybe print some detail of the moon in black over top of it so that you get a little bit of texture there as well, visual texture. So that might be interesting, because then you'd have a moon phase that would show up like that. That might be kind of cool. That certainly has some possibilities. I know for sure that I wouldn't use it in a traditional way, but experimenting with some of the alternative things that you could do with it, and the fact that you can fire it or potentially fire it might also be good. The only problem I could see with the firing, though, might be because I'm not using an inert environment for it. So I'm just firing my enamels in oxygen, because that oxygen is important for the way that the metals in the enamel actually react. It's that, they are oxides that are in there. So it is important that they do react with oxygen. And I'm not sure how the superluminova would react at those temperatures in oxygen, because it may be that they shouldn't be oxidizing at high temperature, and that may destroy them. So anyway, there's some experimentation to be done there to see what happens with it.
Yes, Sarpaneva has done some neat moon phase displays that glow in different ways using various luminous pigments and different approaches to applying superluminova to a timepiece. It's done some really unique pieces. I mean, he's certainly known for his moon phase display. In the vein of applying high-tech technologies to fine watchmaking and high-end collaborations and partnerships, Frédéric Constant has recently announced a brand new escapement and oscillator design that they've developed in partnership with Flexus. And this is a 40 hertz silicon escapement that employs a bistable mechanism to essentially integrate the functions of the pallet fork and the oscillator into one unit. If you aren't familiar with the concept of a bistable mechanism, there's a really well done video by Derek Mueller, who over at Veritasium, who we've mentioned here on the show in the past, that delves into a number of examples of bistable mechanisms and their benefits and the process of developing them. It's just a really simple technology that has really started to become exploited in our modern era with all the sorts of simulations and whatnot that you can do on the computer. It is a mechanism that is stable in two positions. So with this new escapement from Frédéric Constant, when the escape wheel delivers energy to the oscillator, it will snap the oscillator from one orientation to another, and vice versa, back and forth, for as long as there's energy being delivered through the gear train from the mainspring.
Seeing this thing in operation and seeing it vibrating at 40 hertz is impressive. Typically, these sorts of things you're seeing vibrating at the speed are because of some kind of electromechanical mechanism, and seeing a mechanical mechanism doing this thanks to these two states that it's stable in, and the fact that the silicon is able to actually handle moving between these two states quite rapidly. And it is an impressive little thing to see. You almost think that when you're seeing the video of it that it's showing it in faster than real time, but it isn't. It is a 1-to-1 real time. And it is a fascinating little mechanism. It'll be interesting to see if anybody else goes down this road. I could see there being some potential benefits and some potential problems from a servicing point of view, because depending on how this lasts and how it holds up, it may actually hold up to being serviced in very long intervals, right? Because you don't need to worry about lubrication inside of here, and it potentially could run for years without needing the kind of servicing that a normal watch escapement works or requires. And the other thing is that this silicon part is going to be relatively inexpensive for them to make in large numbers. And one of the things we know is that when you're producing any silicon part, that first initial part is usually quite expensive. But with a lot of the mass manufacturing techniques that we've designed for the integrated chip market, it's very easy to manufacture a lot of this stuff now to well within the standards that are required for watchmaking. So it may also be that these are very easy to service in the long run, because you can just buy an inexpensive part from them to drop in and replace the worn one. So it'll be interesting to see exactly where this goes and what they end up doing with it.
Mm-hmm. Silicon tech is certainly trickling down market in the realm of horology. I mean, you can get a Tissot now for a few $100s that has a silicon hairspring in it. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you wanted a silicon hairspring a decade ago, you'd have to fork out tens of thousands of dollars for one of the advanced research pieces from Patek Philippe.
Mm-hmm.
On the servicing side of things, running at that speed, your silicon components are likely going to be absolutely fine and unfazed. And the nice thing about silicon on silicon is that you don't have to lubricate it, which was one of the benefits that Patek Philippe touted with their Pulsomax escapement. But the rest of the gear train, it may end up serving up some problems there, because even just comparing timepieces that operate at much lower frequencies, jumping, say, from 18,000 beats per hour to 28.8, you're going to notice a different wear on the pivots in the gear train. Mm-hmm. And then again, going from 28,800 beats per hour up to 36,000 beats per hour. Again, there's generally more wear and tear noticeable on the pivots within the actual gear train. Mm-hmm. Well, I have a deep appreciation for bistable mechanisms, and I admire the pioneering work Flexus has achieved with this new oscillator and escapement. I think it's a mistake to show it off through the aperture in the dial, just because of how fast it is beating away there. I find there's something humane and almost soothing about watching a mechanical timepiece tick away at a rate of 5 to 8 times per second, but witnessing the oscillator vibrating a literal order of magnitude more than that every time you look down at your wrist, I think you're going to find it just feels downright unnerving. Like just every time you look at your wrist, you're just gonna be like, "Oh, time's flying away from me. I gotta get moving. I gotta get going. I can't sit still." It's just because this thing's just blazing down there on your wrist. Whereas playing this speed on an infinite spectrum, I find Seiko's spring drive mechanism to be very soothing. You're just watching this smooth, uninterrupted flow of the second hand move around the dial. So I think this particular implementation kind of lands in the uncanny valley between the two. Whereas I think that would be less noticeable if you didn't actually see the oscillator moving there on the dial.
They may have been going for the the look that you're getting out of a tourbillon and expecting people to be, interested in seeing it like they do with a tourbillon carriage. But unlike a tourbillon carriage, this is moving, as you say, orders of magnitude faster. It really is quite quick. I think it would be more interesting to be able to just see it from the back so you can turn it over and see what's going on. But seeing it on the dial, I think, is going to be problematic, especially because the rest of the dial is a relatively classic dial. Otherwise, yeah, I think it's going to be kind of challenging to look at this watch on for any length of time, just because of that oscillator bouncing back and forth so quickly.
The Swiss watchmaking industry certainly seems to be embracing silicon, particularly in this domain. There have been a number of other companies releasing similar approaches to actually breaking down time into these discrete elements. I mean, you've got the Zenith Defy, and then things like the Jean Perregaux constant force escapement that was released a number of years ago. The one nice thing about this piece from Frédéric Constant, which is something that FC has been very good at with a number of different complications and whatnot in horology, is the price point. They've really been able to drop the price on this sort of novelty and make it much more accessible than what you'd find with, say, the offerings from GP or Zenith.
It certainly is a reasonable price for what they're doing here. The one thing that I was a little surprised with is that they're claiming that this is only going to hit COSC standards of -4 +6 seconds a day. I'm a little surprised that they're not claiming higher. Maybe they can't guarantee accuracy higher than that. But I'm a little surprised that they're sticking to those standards, considering the high frequency should get you even more accuracy than that. So it'll be interesting to see real world what the numbers actually are on this watch.
Well, the means by which it's regulated is still very similar to a traditional balance wheel. You're moving these inertial weights just like you would in any free sprung balance in order to affect how well it's keeping time.
You're right. While the adjustments are being done the same way, the whole point of the high frequency is to avoid the problems of being bumped, and as well as the orientation affecting the watch as much. So if you can time it by changing your weights around and doing that, that's fine. It should still stay more accurate because it is less affected by the things which are going to affect a normal balance wheel as it's going around. And that's the whole point of having these lightweight, high frequency oscillators like this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I certainly agree with you that higher frequency will hide a number of errors, but you are still dealing with other factors that do play into how something is going to keep time. And who knows, given how fast this thing is operating, it may also be susceptible to some of the same problems that the Accutron watches encountered, in which a bump at the wrong time could actually cause you to skip a few beats, and you end up not keeping time as accurately, simply because the margin of error there between each tick and tock is so small, and the amount of engagement, therefore, is also quite small. I'm surprised they're only shooting for COSC spec, because even Rolex now is doing -2 +2 seconds a day off the line. In practice, the pieces coming off the line are actually, in my experience, operating even better than that. I drop a brand new Rolex on the timing machine, it's just flat lines in all positions. It's just 0 seconds per day. It is mind-rending how precisely they've been able to dial in the precision of their chronergy escapement and their parachrome hairspring. Watches by SJX has a really good overview of this new escapement from Frédéric Constant, which we'll link to in the show notes. And they also include a small video clip of it in action, so you can actually see or at least get some sense of how fast it's moving, because it's actually moving faster than the frames of a video would be able to capture. Another interesting bit of news that came across my radar through Watches by SJX is a new caliber from Citizen, and it is a high-end caliber, which is something that Citizen hasn't traditionally been known for. And they've actually developed this caliber in partnership with Le Jeu Perret. And it's worth noting that Citizen also owns Le Jeu Perret. They bought them. So technically, it's still part of Citizen, but it is a Swiss arm of Citizen. And it's finished quite well. And they've done a really nice job with it. And what I love seeing here, as always, in any mechanical watch, is they went free sprung. So got a nice free sprung balance in there. And it's similar to the Patek Philippe regulating system, their Gyromax regulating system, in the way that it's regulated. Although it is slightly different in its own flavor. And I do appreciate that they have differentiated out a fine system of adjustment and a more coarse-grained system of adjustment there on the balance wheel by having the inertia weights only being about half the size on the fine adjustments as compared to the more coarse-grained adjustment.
It is interesting seeing Citizen diving into a slightly higher end mechanical watch. They've been doing a lot of interesting work in the quartz world. And in fact, they've got a quartz movement. I think it's accurate to 1 second a year, which is insane for something that's internally regulated like that. So it is nice to see them working on something mechanical. It's a nice little movement and it looks great. I don't know what they're planning on doing with it in terms of a product. I know that the watch that it's sitting in on this is a sort of a sports watch, a steel sports watch with a steel bracelet, which looks good if that's what you're sort of looking for. But I don't know when this is actually going to hit the market. But because I think this one that's up on SJX is actually a prototype movement and prototype watch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they do acknowledge that it is indeed a prototype. So the finishing isn't quite up to the level that they intend to have on the actual final product. But even still, it is a noteworthy new addition to the landscape of watch calibers that are out there. And in some other prototype news, back in the summer, we touched on an open source project, quote unquote, open source project called the Open Movement Project. And they have now announced and released 3D plans for the caliber that they intend to produce.
They have released 3D models of it, so I downloaded those and I took a look through it. I'm not sure that this movement is going to set the world on fire, but it is nice to see that they have actually put it out there. It sounds like they have a manufacturing partner who's interested in actually doing the work. They're still looking to collect enough money to have the first run of movements made. I'm still kind of curious to see where they go with this. Is this something that they intend to manufacture and make available as full movements, or is it something where they can supply particular parts of it to somebody? It might be interesting to be able to say, all right, I understand what you're doing. That's great. I like your escapement. I want to buy just the escapement from you, and see if you can purchase just parts of it like that, or whether they plan on doing that at all. And maybe something where they decide to just say, all right, now we've done the work and the development. You guys are on your own to try and manufacture this. I'll be curious to see how that plays out and whether they're able to produce it in enough volume to actually make it worthwhile purchasing.
Yeah, I mean, certainly no Regepi in terms of the design and the aesthetic of it. This looks a lot like the sort of watch caliber that you'd end up with if you were designing by committee, which is effectively what is transpiring here. I mean, there are members of the project literally have voting rights and can make suggestions and whatnot. So this is a design by committee watch caliber. And I think where they're positioning it is to have something to fall back on should ETA completely close off supply again. They've been loosening up on the restrictions in recent years and starting to supply outside companies again, although still not at the same level that they were 10, 20 years ago.
Yeah, the intention of this was supposed to be to make sort of a good, stable sort of workhorse movement that people could use and be able to base other work on. It's not really thin enough to sit there and add a lot of complications onto it without, really beefing up your watch. They do have it in both an automatic and a manual configuration, which is nice. They have a date option on it as well, which is pretty standard. I could see it replacing an ETA movement. It has sort of the same look and feel as an ETA movement. I think it'd be fine. I don't see why it would be problematic. But as I said, I don't think it's going to set the world on fire in terms of, let's say, an independent maker going and really seeking this out because this is a really good looking movement that's going to set their watch apart and sort of make it look different than what everybody else is doing. I think the average watch collector, if they looked at this, they wouldn't necessarily recognize it as being something different than, a standard ETA or Sellita or something like that. So we'll see. I'm curious to see when they get them manufactured and how they respond and work and function and whatnot and sort of what their reliability is like. But it's nice to see that they're finally getting some information out there.
Yeah, the design of it certainly seems inspired by the standard fare of workhorse calibers that are out there right now.
Yeah. And I think really the success of it's going to depend dramatically on what price point they hit when it comes to selling these. If they decide to sell these as movements, if I sit down and say, all right, I want to buy 50 of these, how much am I going to pay per movement for them? If they're not producing it at a sort of a competitive rate to what other people are doing, I don't see there being enough interesting about this particular movement to say, all right, I'm going to buy this versus buying something from Sellita or ETA.
Well, given what we've touched on recently in terms of your aspirations for your own watches, I don't really see this as being something that you would drop into any of the pieces that you aspire to make.
No, I don't see it being interesting for me and my production watches, other than maybe as an experimental piece, just to see what it's like and maybe see about modifying it a little bit. One of the nice things about it is the fact that it does, with the 3D model that's there, I can get exact dimensions off of the gear train, for instance. So it then gives me an easy route to be able to redesign the gear train. I don't have to go and sit there and measure everything and, try and figure out and reverse engineer what an existing movement is. And that's why I say that it'll be interesting to see what they offer in terms of parts afterwards. Maybe, if I could sit there and buy, let's say, wheels and an escapement or something like that from them and just say, look, I'm going to make the main plate and the bridges and everything myself and I'll source the jewels and everything myself and I'll source, whatever. I'll make the parts for the keyless works and everything myself and do all that work. Maybe it's interesting and maybe it's a good alternative if I'm interested in sort of making a very customized version of this watch. But the way that it stands right now, it doesn't really offer enough interesting or useful features to me to sort of want to move away from the sorts of Chen movements that I've been looking at. Even from things like a power reserve point of view, these have a sort of at the low end of what's considered a standard power reserve these days. Nothing like the 96 hours that I'm getting out of the sorts of Chen movements that I'm going to be using. So I don't know how much I would be interested in using these, but it's nice to see that data is out there. It's nice to see that it's an option for people who maybe are looking to use ETA movements, and as you say, maybe that they get taken away from them. So at least this is an alternative, and it is nice to see somebody at least making the effort.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting that not using the jewels from their particular layout, because I'd have to say that the size of the jewels that they've settled on is not to my personal taste. It definitely, by all appearances, seems to be a cost-cutting measure to use the jewels that they have. They're incredibly small, so you're not going to get a very good reserve of lubricant in there, and it's also going to be a pain to get the lubricant in there when you're servicing these. It's just smaller jewels cost less money.
If they can get themselves priced somewhere between a Sellita and an ETA movement, they might do well with it. But again, I don't know what their plan is. I don't know if it's something that they want to go into the manufacturing side of this, or if they've convinced their manufacturing partner to be able to do that. I don't know what their long-term goal is for that, but it's an interesting project, but it's not high up there on my list of things that I'm going to spend a lot of time trying to use in my own work.
Yeah, right now they seem to be in quasi Kickstarter mode, running their own campaign to sell the first 10 timepieces, but they haven't actually listed the price of those timepieces. You have to submit an interest in it first.
I think there was mentioned somewhere, and it's not inexpensive. Like it's in I seem to remember it's in like the 20,000 euro range, I think, for one of those 10 prototype pieces.
Which feels like a hefty sum to pay for this caliber of caliber.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I can certainly think of a number of incredible timepieces you could pick up for that amount of money.
Yeah, particularly with an unknown sort of case and dial and everything like that. You don't know what those are going to look like in terms of the quality.
They have published photos of the case and bracelet, or strap rather, and the dial and the hands. It's all renders, but at least it gives you a sense of what it is they'll be releasing.
Yeah, really. At that point, if you're putting out that kind of money for it, it's there to be supporting the project as opposed to getting true value for the watch that you're buying.
Yeah, absolutely. It is a gesture of support. Open movement prototypes are still in the render stage of development. Things are starting to come together for you on the production side.
This week has been an interesting week in terms of getting things into the shop. I've been working with a few different companies to get things that I'm not interested in working on and making myself. So things like the straps. I finally have my watch straps in hand, and I'm very happy with the look and feel of those. I think that the choice of straps that I went with, I'm happy with. I may make a few changes going forward in terms of maybe a couple of different color designs in the future, but the straps I couldn't be happier with the feel of the straps in particular. Super, super pleased with that. The other thing that I was a little bit concerned about, and I didn't really want to get involved with myself, was making the packaging for this watch. Of course, anytime you're dealing with any kind of a luxury product, you want to make sure that the unboxing experience is something enjoyable for the person who's just invested in this piece that you've made. And so you want to make sure that you have a box that it's appropriate for what it is that you've just made. And so I commissioned a custom wooden box out of the UK. They're made of English ash. They're a beautiful sort of indigo dyed ash, so a nice dark color to it. And I've experimented with a few different laser engraved designs for the top. I decided to try some engine turned patterns that have been laser engraved into the top of the box. And I wasn't sure how that was going to look, that sort of mechanical geometric shape and look, and how it would blend with the texture and the grain of the wood itself. And I have to say, the interplay between the two of them is excellent. It's not at all the same as seeing engine turning in metal, where you're getting that bright reflection off of the bright cut surfaces, but it still gives you a really interesting interplay of light and texture on the top of the box. So super pleased with the way that's come out. So now I can put an order in for the actual production boxes, which was great. Couldn't be happier with the way that those have come out, though.
Mm-hmm. It really does lend a nice touch to the cover of the box, having the pattern in there, and the way that the light interplays off of the wood because of those cuts in the wood. And it's not something I recall having seen on any other wood box. So it's a nice personal touch you've added there.
Yeah, most people tend to go with printing or sometimes with a plaque or something like that. A few people I know have done laser engraving on the tops of boxes, and have done a few interesting things with that, although a lot of people often go with something very simple. This is certainly more complex than what most people would go for. And that's always a danger, right? It's really difficult to balance out how much do you put on top of something like this, and at what point does it overwhelm the design. Oftentimes that simpler is better. Just having the logo sitting there in the middle of the box is nice, and that's a classic way to go for it. But at the same time, doing something unique like this, again, I haven't seen too many people doing any kind of engine turn pattern on their packaging, whether it's through printing or whether it's through engraving or something like that. I don't see a lot of that happening. So it was something that I wanted to experiment with, and I just I included them as experiments to do at the last minute. I hadn't really given it a huge amount of thought before the week that I submitted the designs. For months I've been sort of thinking, I'm just going to put the simple name logo on there. But I'm really happy that I had them run off a couple of different experiments to see how they would look. I had tried them on some scrap wood at the studio because we have a CO2 laser at the studio, so I did try it on that. But the look is very different going from the light pale colored wood that I was engraving at the shop versus the darker dyed wood that they're using. The look and feel of it is very, very different, and I'm really glad that I did it because it's totally worth it.
Yeah, I think those last minute experiments will be of benefit to the final product here, because the way the light plays off the wood, particularly in that radial pattern, I could see that box just sitting on a counter, and as you're walking by it, the way the light would catch your eye as you're going by would almost be like the box saying to you, "Come over here, open me up, come look at me."
Yeah, the nice thing about radial patterns like that is that they really do change a lot depending on how you move and how you look at it. I've been a big fan of radial engine turn patterns in my work. Everything from the back of that iPhone that I did a number of years ago, a number of the pendants that I've done over the years have had radial patterns. The dial that I'm working on right now has a radial pattern on it. I think that they're really underused in engine turning, and they really have a look and feel that you don't get through the circular patterns that you get on a Rose engine, for instance. I know that's classically what people like Breguet are using. A lot of the work that Kari does. There's a lot of circular Rose engine work that's done on those, and a lot of the straight line work that's being done is in things like the basket weave patterns and the clou de Paris, things like that. You don't see a large number of designs with these radial patterns, these radial straight line patterns. And if you use them well, they really do stand out, and they're tough to look away from. And it's played out in this case as well, even though you don't get those bright cuts. Just seeing the wood in different ways and the way that parts of that pattern are, look under certain lights and whatnot. It really does make a nice sort of package at the end of it. And you also get that texture as well, that feel that you're not going to get any other way because it is a deep engraving. Yeah, I still haven't decided exactly on which one I'm going to do for the final project. I think the radial pattern that I've chosen is probably going to be the one I go with. I do also have a circular pattern that I used, a classic barley row pattern that I used. I may also experiment with a few other patterns just here in the shop and see if any of the other ones sort of jump out at me even more. But right now, I think that radial pattern is probably the one that I'm going with. And we'll make sure to get some good photos of that closer to the release date. I'm not going to release the photos of it just yet, but closer to the release date of the watch, I'll start posting some photos of the packaging as well.
Now, from the limited time that I've seen them, the radial pattern would certainly have my vote as well. I think in this application, it strikes just the right note about balancing that simplicity and sophistication.
It's been the overwhelming favorite of everybody who's seen it now. I maybe about 10 people have seen the final prototypes, and overwhelmingly everybody has liked that radial pattern. So I think it's going to be really tough to bump that one from the top of the list. I may also try a couple of other radial patterns just to see if there's maybe something that works a little bit better, maybe slightly different frequency of the sine wave itself. The lines that are radiating out from the center are a standard sine wave pattern. So I may experiment a little bit with changing up the frequency as well as the amplitude of those sine waves. I think the number of cuts that I've got around the outside, I think that probably works well. Just because if you try and do too many, then it ends up looking a little bit weird down towards the center. And if you don't have enough, then it doesn't look good enough around the outside of the box. So I think I've got a good balance of sort of the number of divisions around the radial pattern. But I may experiment a little bit with the actual sine wave itself and see if I can find something that maybe works a little bit better.
Well, we'll keep the finished look under wraps for now. But since it isn't secret sauce, since we've touched on it here on the show before, for anyone who's wanting to experiment with applying guilloché patterns to wood or to print work or to metal work, whatever they may want to apply it to themselves, what is the software that you are using to do this?
The application I'm using is called Excentro. There's two different versions of it. There's a pro version and a light version. The light version is the one that I use. It certainly has all the features that I happen to need. It was designed by a Russian software developer who made it for the security printing industry. A lot of security printing obviously went from using manual machines like the Rose engines and the straight line engines that were being used in the early days of security printing into actual graphic design applications to be able to do the same kinds of things. And this was designed specifically for being able to do and design security printing. So Excentro is the name of the product. The light version is relatively inexpensive. I want to say it's around $50 American for that. The pro version is a little more expensive. I want to say it's $500 or $600, but it's excellent. And you can dive really deep into doing extremely complex patterns, interesting gradients and things like that. If you want to be able to do your own certificates and things like that are unique and would be very challenging to be able to reproduce, then this is the way to go with it. If you want to make your own money, you could certainly design your own money with this. I use it for just doing very simple engine turning patterns and sort of proving out the way that some of them are going to work. And it's nice for that. And a number of the people that I know that use it are doing it for that, to experiment with different counts of, let's say, the number of lobes on a rosette or the particular patterns that you're going to be designing for a pattern bar and how they sort of interplay with each other and how you can move those patterns around and offset them a little bit to get different designs. So it's a nice way of sort of being able to experiment with engine turning patterns without needing to spend a lot of time and money, let's say, machining actual rosettes or actual pattern bars.
After months and months of work researching and sourcing components, it's nice to finally see things clicking together for you and product and physical goods actually starting to arrive there at the studio. And hopefully by next episode, you should actually have some of your bridges, or at least the prototype bridges for your movement in hand as well.
Thanks for listening to Off Hours. You can find detailed show notes at offhours.show. If you'd like to keep up to date with the show, follow us on Twitter @offhours. Jon can be found on Twitter @UnderTheLoop, and Chris can be found on Twitter and Instagram @silver_hand.